On June 28, 1919, 100 years ago today, the Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, supposedly the war to end all wars. But that pact perhaps did the very opposite. Now widely considered a failure, the treaty helped seed the ground for what would come 2 decades later, the Second World War. With us now from the nation's capital for more, Tim Cook. He is the First World War historian at the Canadian War Museum and author of several books, including The Secret History of Soldiers, How Canadians Survived the Great War. And Tim, we're very happy to have you on our airwaves again. How are you tonight?
I'm good, thanks. Nice to be back on the show.
Good stuff. Take us back to 100 years ago today. What was going on in Versailles, France at this moment?
Well, this was the historic day, as you said, where the treaty was signed to end the First World War. The negotiations had gone on for 6 months. They had been agonizing. The world had come to France, to Paris, and now they were in the Hall of Mirrors, and the Germans were brought in and forced to sign this treaty that they did not want to sign. And as you said, it has led to much turmoil, much discussion, much debate. Was it a fair treaty? Was it punitive? Was it draconian? Was it not hard enough? Over 100 years, historians have talked about it and engaged with it. And it seems right 100 years later to reflect upon it.
So let's unpack some of that. Why did it take so long for this treaty to get signed?
Well, I like to think that the First World War took over 4 years, massive warfare. As you know, we often focus on the battles and the campaigns. We shouldn't expect that the peace would have been an easy thing to achieve. And when the peacemakers came together, January of 1919, thinking about how to end this terrible war, there were no easy solutions.
We are following up on our conversation tonight with a documentary on TVO tomorrow night. The documentary, appropriately enough, called Paris 1919. And it'll be on tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Let's show a little snippet of that right now, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
As Paris prepares for peace, there's a celebration south of Berlin for German soldiers returning home. Many Germans don't think they lost the war. They signed an armistice, not an admission of defeat.
Tim, I have to pick up on that line. How is it the German people did not feel as if they had lost the war?
That's astonishing, isn't it? This war had raged for 4 years. Some 2 million German soldiers had been killed. The Allied blockade had starved Germany. By 1916, there were thousands of deaths. By the end of the war, about 750,000 Germans had starved to death or died from disease brought on by malnourishment. Their armies were defeated on the Western Front, and yet the war ended very oddly. The armistice of November 11th, an armistice itself, a temporary truce. Germany did not feel it had been defeated, even though they were, and soundly so. And so from the start and the attempt to find a peace, the Germans thought they were coming into this discussion and debate not as equals, but as having a say. And of course, the Allies would have none of that. The four leaders in Britain and France, the United States and Italy, and the fifth in Japan, were having nothing with negotiations. They would dictate to the Germans the conditions of the peace.
Well, having said that, it was different from the end of World War II, which was a complete and unconditional surrender. And one wonder, I mean, let's play the historian's game here. Might it have been better not to have signed the armistice, but rather to have let the war go on and absolutely punished and pummeled Germany even more to the point where they did unconditionally surrender?
That's an interesting observation, and I'll turn to Andrew McNaughton, who was a senior Canadian gunner and later Army commander in the Second World War. And he wrote a letter saying, we should keep going. The men want to keep fighting because we need to defeat Germany totally. Now, I think many Canadians, many Australians, British, French, Belgians were fought out. No one wanted to keep fighting. This war had claimed 9.5 million, 10 million battlefield deaths. And so that's probably not realistic, but I think your point is a good one. The Second World War ends with Germany in ruins. There is no one in Germany who thinks that they have not lost. They need only to look around them, standing in the dead cities, being beaten on every front. The First World War is different, and we know that the anger that will emerge from the peace process in Germany will allow for the telling of stories, the creation of new narratives by none other than some like Adolf Hitler, who said that the German armies were not defeated. They were stabbed in the back. And this will allow for a very uneasy period in that interwar years before, as we know now with hindsight, that the Second World War will erupt again.
Yes. Now, of course, during World War II, there were significant campaigns inside the German borders. And I wonder if you could help us on the 4 years between 1914 and 1918. Were there a lot of military campaigns and utter destruction inside Germany in the way that there was during World War II?
The short answer is no, there weren't. And the Germans fought in the First World War largely on the soil of other countries. And the start of the war, with the Schlieffen Plan and the Western Front, the Germans nearly won. And when they were defeated at the Battle of the Marne in September of 1914, trenches, of course, were through Belgium and France. And Germany occupied about 90% of Belgium, about 15% of France. And the war was fought there on the Western Front. And so this also contributes to this perception that not only has Germany not been defeated, but they have engaged in a fighting retreat of some sort when they are so clearly soundly beaten in 1918. The Allied armies, of course, we've talked about the 100 Days campaign before, driving the Germans back, and yet the war was not fought on their soil.
If I can get historians arguing with each other, it's called a good day's work here in these parts. So let me see if I can get you to pick a fight with Margaret Macmillan here, who, of course, wrote Paris 1919 and had this to say in the New York Times on Christmas Day in the year 2010. Let me read an excerpt of that. Not many people noticed at the time, but World War I ended this year. Well, in a sense it did. On October 3rd, 2010, Germany finally paid off the interest on bonds that had been taken out by the shaky Weimar government in an effort to pay the war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. While the amount, less than $100 million, was trivial by today's standards, the payment brought to a close one of the most poisonous chapters of the 20th century. It also, unfortunately, brought back to life an insidious historical myth that the reparations and other treaty measures were so odious that they made Adolf Hitler's rise and World War II inevitable. Are you with Margaret Macmillan in as much as reparations were not the cause of World War II?
Yes, I am with her. I think there's a lot to unpack there, but if we think of the treaty itself, there were a number of odious elements to it for the German people, and the reparations were a part of that. So too was the 231st clause, which was called the War Guilt Clause. Germany had to accept for having caused this war, and along with that came the reparations that they would have to pay hundreds of billions of dollars. Eventually, I think they settled on about 230 billion in the early 1930s. And all of this, again, was so difficult for the German people to swallow. And people like Adolf Hitler used this and chipped away at the treaty. The treaty, of course, also forced the disbanding of the German military force for the most part. And all of this seemed to be draconian, too much to bear. Now, of course, we should remember that the Germans, when they defeated the Russians, enacted a terrible peace process upon them, forcing them to give up 10% of Russian land and billions in payments. And so we must understand it in the context of the time. There was tremendous hurt and anger and pain. Those 9.5, 10 million dead. The French wanted revenge. And that was tempered against trying to find a peaceful solution. And to come back to Margaret's statement there, I think it's a good one. It allows us to think about the effects of war, the after effects, the aftermath. The war may have ended on November 11th, 1918, at least on the Western Front, but it has reverberated to this day and will continue to go forward as we continue to clash over its meaning and to dissect the various questions involved here. And the treaty is essential there because almost from the start, the Germans who felt forced into signing it then began to chip away at it and pick away, and the anger and the unrest that came out of it was crucial for the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. But I think it's too much to say that you can go from 1919 to 1939. I think that takes away all of the errors that are made in the 1930s, the failure of the League of Nations, the failure of nations to act, Hitler's own massive aggression, the Depression. It's too much to blame it all on the treaty.
Understood. Let's set up the next question by once again going to the documentary that we're going to show tomorrow night at 9 o'clock on TVO, Paris 1919. Here's another clip. Sheldon, please.
The British numbers aren't in yet. Not so many farms, but her shipping is decimated.
The real problem will come when each country tries to put a dollar figure on what a dead soldier is worth, what he might have earned had he lived. No accounting of any war in history has tried to do that.
How did they figure it out, Tim? What Germany should pay to the other countries?
Well, the war had raised armies of citizen soldiers, and in the aftermath, there were armies of historians and economists and civil servants and politicians trying to put a dollar figure on what this war had cost. And massively complicated, hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation created to figure out what should Germany pay. And by forcing Germany to accept blame for the war, the reparations were meant to help Belgium and France primarily rebuild their countries. I mean, they had been attacked, invaded, and occupied. But other countries needed payment, wanted payment. And I think the uneasy tension here, as you've alluded to, was how would you measure a war and the cost? It was the cost in lives, of lost labor, of agony of the bereaved parents and wives and children. It was destruction to massive industry. It was destruction of the very land that was eviscerated by tens of millions of shells. It was disruption of trade. I mean, it went on, and they were calculating this in a way not dissimilar to how they tried to count the dead, the soldiers lost on the battlefield. And all of it, of course, was open to interpretation and, on Germany's side, questioning the costs. It was, I think if we are to condemn the treaty, that is one thing years later we can look at and just say it was not realistic. It created too many opportunities for people to say a dead soldier, is he worth $100 or $500? And I think ultimately that became a festering sore.
We want to show two maps now. The first one is going to be Europe in 1914 as the war breaks out. And there's that map. And we see Russia, as it was then called. We see the Austria-Hungarian Empire in the middle. If you look to the bottom right, I'm describing all this for people listening on podcast who can't see it. We see the Ottoman Empire, as it was then called. And then let's go to a post-World War I map. We're going to flip that over, and we see a lot of name changes. Russia is now the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia is in the middle of the map. Austria and Hungary are two separate countries. The Ottoman Empire in the bottom right is gone. It's now called Turkey. Let's just have you, if you would, amplify a bit on that. How significantly, in your view, did the map of the world change as a result of World War I?
It's a shocking upheaval, and one of the reasons we call this the Great War is the great disruption and destruction, those millions of dead, additional millions civilians who die of malnutrition, disease, genocide. And yet there was geopolitical changes that were unimaginable. 4 dynastic empires were destroyed, as you mentioned there. The Russians, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. No one could have anticipated this. These were empires that had lasted for hundreds of years. And this war destroys them, shatters them. And out of the ashes come these new countries. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, a number of Finland returns to the map. Poland returns after more than 100 years. Germany dismembered. And to simply look at that map, I think, just tells you something of the destruction that came from this war. And if we want to bring it forward, think of Iraq and the American invasion and victory, and then the challenge of rebuilding. Well, think of Europe, where you've lost not a country, but 4 empires destroyed, new empires, new countries emerging. Many of them driven by the Wilsonian, the President Woodrow Wilson's ideas of self-determination, interpreting them in different ways. It was utter chaos. And at the same time, Europe is in ruins, the millions of dead, there is starvation. Imagine trying to find a way forward here. The peacemakers and the challenges they faced was just astonishing.
Let's talk about Wilson for a moment here. When the American president came to Paris for those negotiations 100 years ago and came with his idea of a League of Nations and a 14-point plan, what was his mission, in your view?
Well, the United States, of course, was neutral for much of the war. Woodrow Wilson, in fact, had been elected in 1916 on keeping the United States out of the war. But the Americans were slowly drawn in, largely from the German unrestricted submarine warfare campaign that sunk ships, but also because they had begun to realize that they should side with the liberal democracies. But Wilson came with his ideas and his points, which had been announced in January of 1918, and they were complicated and idealistic, and they talked about freedom of action and self-government and democracy. And these are terms I think we can understand today, but they were foreign at the time for many people, and not easy to implement. No one was quite certain what Wilson meant, and in fact, he admitted he didn't know what he had meant either. And yet all of these aspiring countries and nationalistic movements, they clung to the 14 points. They saw it as a way forward, some to carve out a new country, some to guide them into this uncertain future within the ruins and ashes of these dynastic empires that collapsed. And Wilson was the driving force there, but of course he had to deal with David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and all of the victorious nations were jousting and negotiating for land and reparation payments, and it was an unholy mess. And Wilson tried to guide the peace treaty process. The League of Nations, as you mentioned, was an important part of his vision. And what emerged, I think, not surprisingly, considering the aftermath of this horrible war, was something quite different from what he had envisioned.
Now, we know from the end of World War II, which begat the United Nations, that there was an instinct and a desire for all the countries of the world to come together and ensure that war wouldn't happen anymore. So, okay, the League of Nations failed. But with your historian's lens on, can you say that his instincts were right and it was the right idea, even though the League of Nations did ultimately fail?
Yeah, I think we can say that. I think we can be generous there. I think the idea of nations coming together to talk, maybe to use Churchill's phrase, to jaw rather than war, is the right one, of course. And why the League failed is a number of things. The Americans never ratified the treaty, and so they were not a part of the League. The League had no teeth, and so it didn't have any real way to impose decisions on countries that were acting as bad actors. And this began to emerge in the 1930s with the Depression, the rearmament of nations, the Japanese invasion of China, Manchuria, and then primarily Mussolini, the fascist leader in Italy who had invaded Abyssinia. And the League tried to push back against him, tried to invoke embargoes, of which Canada, interestingly, played a key role, and then an inglorious walking away from the table. And so we contributed to the failure of the League of Nations as well. But I think you're right. With the rise of the dictators, with Hitler, Mussolini, maybe to come back to Churchill's phrase, there was no jaw that would work there. And what we learned, I think, passing through another horrific war, the Second World War that killed 60 million, saw the rise of two new superpowers, the Soviet Union, the United States, the massive decolonization of the empires. We did again turn to a body, the United Nations, that could perhaps help guide us forward. And as we know, it has not been without problems and challenges, but it is a force for good in this world.
Tim, let's finish up on this. As we sit here 100 years to the day after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, what do you think the important lessons are from that experience that are still relevant for us today?
The search for peace is not easy. When we talk about the First World War, we often talk about the battles and campaigns and soldiers and the struggle to find victory. But there was just as powerful a struggle to find peace and enduring peace. And I think there are lessons in the Treaty of Versailles. What do you do with a defeated nation? What do you do when your people are screaming for blood, when they look around and see millions of dead? You understand the impulse for revenge, to make the other people suffer, and yet perhaps lessons here are that there are different ways forward. And every case is different, but yet nonetheless, we must remember that when we go to war, and when war aims are achieved, as rare as that often is, there is a legacy. You simply don't get to bring your soldiers home. And even that we know. Think of Afghanistan and the legacy there of Canadian soldiers suffering from the trauma of war. Wars end at a certain period, but they continue to be fought and refought. They have a long, dark shadow. And to think maybe 100 years ago with the Treaty of Versailles, after the months of agonizing negotiations and the signing of the treaty, many of the Allied politicians and people thought that the war had ended, that this terrible conflict and catastrophe was done. And what we know, of course, is 100 years later, it is still with us. Its dark legacy still infusing the world we live in. And perhaps that is a broad lesson that might be drawn from the signing of the treaty 100 years ago today.
That's Tim Cook, the First World War historian at the Canadian War Museum in our nation's capital. Tim, we always appreciate your taking our calls, coming on TVO, and sharing your historical perspectives on these important anniversaries. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.